Whispers beneath the ruins, women's secrets of survival. Beneath the ashes, they whispered. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that survival was often hidden in whispers. Not the loud proclamations of soldiers, not the speeches of leaders, not the commands carved into stone by generals, but the quiet words exchanged beneath ruins, in cellars, behind broken walls, in voices so low they trembled like candlelight. Whispers were the currency of survival. Whispers were secrets that saved lives, and whispers were scars that endured long after the rubble was cleared. I remember my grandmother telling me how women whispered beneath the ashes of their burned homes. They whispered to warn each other of soldiers moving through the village. They whispered to share where a loaf of bread might still be hidden. They whispered prayers when silence itself became unbearable. The whispers were fragile, yet they carried more weight than any weapon. To speak too loudly was to risk discovery. To remain silent was to drown in despair. And so women whispered. Their voices were thin threads stretched across ruins, but those threads held families, neighbors, and hope together. The truth they don't tell is that whispers were dangerous. Every word carried risk. A wrong ear could mean death. A careless phrase could betray someone hiding in the shadows. Women learned to measure words like grains of salt, to let them dissolve slowly, to ensure they nourished without destroying. They became masters of speaking without speaking, of conveying more in a glance or a pause than in a sentence. Their survival was written in the rhythm of whispers. I once heard of a woman who whispered recipes to her children at night while they hid in a cellar. There was no flour, no sugar, no fire, no milk. But she whispered the steps as if she were cooking, as if the smell of bread might fill their imagination. Her children survived those nights of hunger by listening to recipes whispered into the dark. They never ate the bread, but they tasted survival in her voice. Her scar was that she carried a kitchen in her memory while the world around her starved. Beneath ruins, women whispered secrets they could not write down. They told each other who had been taken, who had returned, who had disappeared into silence. They whispered names so they would not be forgotten. They whispered lullabies into children's ears so they would sleep despite the explosions outside. They whispered lies, too, sometimes. Soft assurances that tomorrow would be better, that the war would end soon, that fathers would come home. Lies became whispers of survival, necessary fictions carried in low voices to soothe unbearable nights. The truth they don't tell is that whispers carried grief too heavy to speak aloud. Women whispered their confessions into the rubble to no one and everyone at once. They whispered apologies to children they could not feed, to husbands they could not save, to parents they could not bury. They whispered to themselves, their words like invisible threads tying them to life. Without whispers, they might have vanished into silence. I remember standing in the ruins of a bombed-out church where my grandmother once prayed. She said women used to gather there, not to sing hymns, but to whisper prayers. No priest, no altar, just voices carried softly, afraid of being heard by the wrong ears. The church was no longer a sanctuary of stone, but of whispers. Their prayers were not loud declarations of faith, but quiet negotiations with despair. Each whisper was both plea and defiance. Children learned to whisper before they learned to read. They watched their mothers lower their voices, lean close, shape words with careful lips. They understood instinctively that whispers carried weight, that loudness was dangerous. A generation grew up measuring their breath, speaking softly, hiding their voices. The scar of whispering was that even in peace, many never spoke loudly again. They carried the war in their voices, trained forever to be cautious. The truth they don't tell is that whispers became memory. Long after the ruins were cleared, women still leaned close when telling secrets, still lowered their voices when speaking of loss, still whispered prayers at night, though no one was listening. Their survival had been written in whispers, and so their lives carried that rhythm. Whispering was no longer just survival, it was who they had become. Beneath the ashes, women whispered. They whispered to endure, to feed, to soothe, to warn, to remember, to lie, to pray. Their whispers were fragile but powerful, invisible but eternal. And though the world outside may never have heard them, those whispers built the foundations of survival that history forgets to record. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that their loudest acts of endurance were spoken softly. Their survival was carved not in shouts, but in whispers beneath ruins. And if you listen closely, you can still hear them. Voices like ashes carried by wind, fragile but unbroken. Quiet, but eternal. Secrets written on skin. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that survival was sometimes written on their skin. Not with ink, not with paper, but with scars, bruises, burns, and marks carried like secret codes. Their bodies became archives of everything endured, stories carved without consent, memories recorded in flesh. These were not only wounds of pain. They were messages, hidden truths carried forward when words were too dangerous. I remember hearing my grandmother say, "The body remembers what the mouth cannot say." At the time, I didn't understand. Later, when I saw the faint burn on her arm, the scar that never faded though decades had passed, I began to realize what she meant. She never told the story of that scar, but it was there, etched into her skin like a letter written in fire. Her silence was the envelope. Her body, the message. The truth they don't tell is that women carried maps of survival on their skin. A scar on the hand might mean nights spent digging in rubble to find food. A bruise fading slowly might tell of hands that grabbed too hard in the dark. A line across the back might tell of carrying wood too heavy for a body already starved. Their bodies became texts that only those who knew how to look could read. I once met a woman who traced the scars on her forearms while she spoke. She never explained them, but each line was a pause in her voice, a hesitation, a shadow across her eyes. She didn't need to explain. The scars spoke louder than any words. They said, "I was here. I endured. I survived what you cannot imagine." Her skin carried what her silence refused. Sometimes women used their bodies deliberately as records. They scratched names into wood and then pressed their skin against it, letting the imprint remain until it faded. They tattooed small marks, invisible to others but clear to themselves, as reminders of days survived. They marked their bodies not for beauty, not for pride, but for memory, to ensure that even if their voices were silenced, their skin would carry testimony. The truth they don't tell is that shame was also written on skin. Women violated in war carried scars invisible to the eye but seared into their bodies. They flinched at touch, avoided mirrors, hid beneath layers of clothing. Their skin felt foreign, as if it belonged not to them but to the war itself. They carried marks no one could see but everyone could feel. Their survival was hidden in the tension of their muscles, in the way they held their shoulders, in the way they moved through space. I remember once watching my mother button her blouse up to her neck, even on the hottest summer days. She said she preferred modesty, but I know now it was more than that. It was armor. Her body held secrets, scars she never wanted to reveal, stories she never wanted read. Her silence was not emptiness. It was protection. Children learned to read these scars without being told. They noticed the way their mothers avoided certain movements, the way they concealed their arms, the way they shifted uncomfortably at certain words. They absorbed the language of scars as if by instinct, carrying invisible knowledge of survival coded into gestures and silences. Their own bodies learned caution without understanding why. The truth they don't tell is that women's bodies were not only marked by suffering, but by resilience. Calloused hands told of endless labor to feed children. Wrinkled faces carried lines carved by sleepless nights spent watching over others. Bent backs testified to years of carrying burdens heavier than any human should bear. Their bodies were not only archives of pain, but monuments of endurance. I once held the hand of an old woman as she told me how she survived the famine. Her hand was thin, the skin paper-like, but the grip was strong. She said, "This hand planted potatoes in frozen soil. This hand stole bread from the edge of death. This hand buried my child and still had strength to feed the others." Her hand was more than flesh. It was history, carved and preserved, a scarred relic of survival. Secrets written on skin were not only individual, they were collective. Women recognized each other's scars in silence. A glance at a burn, a tremor in a hand, a limp in a step. These were codes that needed no explanation. They were whispers carried in bodies. They bound women together in quiet recognition. You too. You endured. You understand. Their scars were invisible letters exchanged in glances, a secret language of survival. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that even when words were silenced, their bodies spoke. They carried memory not in books but in bruises, not in speeches but in scars. And though the world often ignored those messages, Though history books rarely recorded them, the truth remains written on their skin. Secrets written on skin remind us that the body is more honest than memory. It carries what we forget, what we deny, what we bury. It holds whispers beneath the surface, visible only to those willing to see. The scars of women in war are not just wounds. They are stories. They are survival. They are memory refusing to die. The bread made of ashes. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that survival was often baked out of nothing. When flour was gone, when ovens were destroyed, when hunger gnawed so deep that children's cries echoed like broken bells, women still found ways to create bread. Sometimes it was bread made of ashes, sometimes of weeds, sometimes of dust mixed with water. It was not food as nourishment. It was food as memory, food as hope, food as defiance. I remember hearing a story about a woman who ground tree bark into powder, mixed it with boiling water, and baked it on flat stones. The bread was bitter, almost inedible, but she gave it to her children anyway. They chewed slowly, swallowing despair disguised as sustenance. "It is bread," she told them. And in saying so, she gave them something more important than taste. She gave them survival. Her scar was that every loaf reminded her of real bread she could not provide. The truth they don't tell is that women turned hunger into invention. They mixed soil with herbs to trick the stomach, brewed weeds into bitter soups, roasted seeds collected from fields long abandoned. They learned to disguise famine with creativity, to stretch one grain into a meal, to turn ashes into bread. Every act was both desperation and brilliance. Their survival was not written in abundance, but in scraps transformed into sustenance by hands unwilling to surrender. I once knew a woman who said she could never throw away breadcrumbs, not even in peace. She would collect every crumb, fold it in her palm, and save it for later. When asked why, she whispered, "Because I know what it means when there is no bread." Her scar was not hunger itself, but the memory of hunger etched into her habits. Even in abundance, she lived as if famine still pressed at her door. The bread made of ashes carried shame too. Mothers gave children food that made them sick, food that scraped their throats, food that offered more pain than nourishment. And yet, they gave it anyway, because nothing was worse than an empty hand. Women whispered apologies with every bite they handed over, their eyes heavy with guilt. The scars of hunger were not only in stomachs, but in hearts that felt they had failed, though survival itself was proof of their success. The truth they don't tell is that hunger silenced pride. Women begged when they had never begged before, stole when they had never stolen, bartered their dignity for a handful of flour. Some offered heirlooms, wedding rings, even their own labor for crumbs. Others endured humiliation just to bring back enough food to quiet children for a night. Their scars were not only from starvation, but from the weight of survival bought at a cost no one should bear. I remember my grandmother whispering about how she once traded the last photograph of her parents for a loaf of bread. "I fed my children," she said, "but I lost their faces." Her voice trembled with grief, but also with strength. She had chosen survival over memory, bread over photograph. Her scar lived not only in hunger, but in the silence of her walls, where no pictures remained. Children grew up with hunger carved into their bones. They licked plates clean, fought over scraps, learned to value food more than toys, more than dreams. They carried invisible scars, their bodies smaller, their eyes sharper, their movements quicker. Hunger shaped them into survivors even before they understood the word. Their mothers carried those scars too. Guilt that never faded, grief that no feast could erase. The bread made of ashes was not only food. It was ritual. Women baked even when there was nothing to bake with. They gathered stones, lit small fires, pressed mixtures of weeds and dust together, and called it bread. The act itself was survival. To bake was to insist on life, to pretend for a moment that war had not stolen everything. Bread was not just food, it was dignity, it was hope, it was memory disguised as sustenance. The truth they don't tell is that women kept those rituals long after war ended. They baked bread even when no one was hungry, kneading with hands that trembled, whispering prayers as ovens warmed. For them, bread was not just food. It was testimony. It was remembrance of famine survived, of children kept alive, of nights endured. Every loaf baked in peace carried the scar of bread made of ashes. I remember once biting into bread my grandmother had baked. It was dense, heavy, not like the light bread from the market. She smiled faintly and said, "This is bread that remembers." I didn't understand until later that she was baking the past into the present, ensuring memory lived on. Her scars had become recipes, her silence turned into loaves. The bread made of ashes tells us that survival is not beautiful. It is desperate, bitter, imperfect. But it is survival. Women fed their families with nothing, transformed scraps into sustenance, carried hunger in their hands and gave it as love. Their scars remind us that bread is not only food, it is memory, it is defiance, it is life itself. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that hunger was endured not with strength alone, but with invention born of despair. Women made bread out of ashes, out of weeds, out of air. And though the taste was bitter, the act was sacred. Their scars remain in every crumb saved, every meal shared, every loaf baked in remembrance. The truth they don't tell is that women's bodies were not only marked by suffering, but by resilience. Calloused hands told of endless labor to feed children. Wrinkled faces carried lines carved by sleepless nights spent watching over others. Bent backs testified to years of carrying burdens heavier than any human should bear. Their bodies were not only archives of pain, but monuments of endurance. I once held the hand of an old woman as she told me how she survived the famine. Her hand was thin, the skin paper-like, but the grip was strong. She said, "This hand planted potatoes in frozen soil. This hand stole bread from the edge of death. This hand buried my child and still had strength to feed the others." Her hand was more than flesh. It was history, carved and preserved, a scarred relic of survival. Secrets written on skin were not only individual, they were collective. Women recognized each other's scars in silence. A glance at a burn, a tremor in a hand, a limp in a step. These were codes that needed no explanation. They were whispers carried in bodies. They bound women together in quiet recognition. You too. You endured. You understand. Their scars were invisible letters exchanged in glances, a secret language of survival. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that even when words were silenced, their bodies spoke. They carried memory not in books but in bruises, not in speeches but in scars. And though the world often ignored those messages, though history books rarely recorded them, the truth remains written on their skin. Secrets written on skin remind us that the body is more honest than memory. It carries what we forget, what we deny, what we bury. It holds whispers beneath the surface, visible only to those willing to see. The scars of women in war are not just wounds. They are stories. They are survival. They are memory refusing to die. The bread made of ashes. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that survival was often baked out of nothing. When flour was gone, when ovens were destroyed, when hunger gnawed so deep that children's cries echoed like broken bells, women still found ways to create bread. Sometimes it was bread made of ashes, sometimes of weeds, sometimes of dust mixed with water. It was not food as nourishment. It was food as memory, food as hope, food as defiance. I remember hearing a story about a woman who ground tree bark into powder, mixed it with boiling water, and baked it on flat stones. The bread was bitter, almost inedible, but she gave it to her children anyway. They chewed slowly, swallowing despair disguised as sustenance. "It is bread," she told them. And in saying so, she gave them something more important than taste. She gave them survival. Her scar was that every loaf reminded her of real bread she could not provide. The truth they don't tell is that women turned hunger into invention. They mixed soil with herbs to trick the stomach, brewed weeds into bitter soups, roasted seeds collected from fields long abandoned. They learned to disguise famine with creativity, to stretch one grain into a meal, to turn ashes into bread. Every act was both desperation and brilliance. Their survival was not written in abundance, but in scraps transformed into sustenance by hands unwilling to surrender. I once knew a woman who said she could never throw away breadcrumbs, not even in peace. She would collect every crumb, fold it in her palm, and save it for later. When asked why, she whispered, "Because I know what it means when there is no bread." Her scar was not hunger itself, but the memory of hunger etched into her habits. Even in abundance, she lived as if famine still pressed at her door. The bread made of ashes carried shame too. Mothers gave children food that made them sick, food that scraped their throats, food that offered more pain than nourishment. And yet, they gave it anyway, because nothing was worse than an empty hand. Women whispered apologies with every bite they handed over, their eyes heavy with guilt. The scars of hunger were not only in stomachs but in hearts that felt they had failed, though survival itself was proof of their success. The truth they don't tell is that hunger silenced pride. Women begged when they had never begged before, stole when they had never stolen, bartered their dignity for a handful of flour. Some offered heirlooms, wedding rings, even their own labor for crumbs. Others endured humiliation just to bring back enough food to quiet children for a night. Their scars were not only from starvation, but from the weight of survival bought at a cost no one should bear. I remember my grandmother whispering about how she once traded the last photograph of her parents for a loaf of bread. "I fed my children," she said, "but I lost their faces." Her voice trembled with grief, but also with strength. She had chosen survival over memory, bread over photograph. Her scar lived not only in hunger, but in the silence of her walls, where no pictures remained. Children grew up with hunger carved into their bones. They licked plates clean, fought over scraps, learned to value food more than toys, more than dreams. They carried invisible scars, their bodies smaller, their eyes sharper, their movements quicker. Hunger shaped them into survivors even before they understood the word. Their mothers carried those scars too. Guilt that never faded, grief that no feast could erase. The bread made of ashes was not only food. It was ritual. Women baked even when there was nothing to bake with. They gathered stones, lit small fires, pressed mixtures of weeds and dust together, and called it bread. The act itself was survival. To bake was to insist on life, to pretend for a moment that war had not stolen everything. Bread was not just food, it was dignity, it was hope, it was memory disguised as sustenance. The truth they don't tell is that women kept those rituals long after war ended. They baked bread even when no one was hungry, kneading with hands that trembled, whispering prayers as ovens warmed. For them, bread was not just food. It was testimony. It was remembrance of famine survived, of children kept alive, of nights endured. Every loaf baked in peace carried the scar of bread made of ashes. I remember once biting into bread my grandmother had baked. It was dense, heavy, not like the light bread from the market. She smiled faintly and said, "This is bread that remembers." I didn't understand until later that she was baking the past into the present, ensuring memory lived on. Her scars had become recipes, her silence turned into loaves. The bread made of ashes tells us that survival is not beautiful. It is desperate, bitter, imperfect. But it is survival. Women fed their families with nothing, transformed scraps into sustenance, carried hunger in their hands and gave it as love. Their scars remind us that bread is not only food, it is memory, it is defiance. It is life itself. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that hunger was endured not with strength alone, but with invention born of despair. Women made bread out of ashes, out of weeds, out of air. And though the taste was bitter, the act was sacred. Their scars remain in every crumb saved, every meal shared, every loaf baked in remembrance. The silent bargains. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that survival was often purchased with silence. Not silence as absence of sound, but silence as currency. Women made bargains that no history book records, exchanges of dignity, of loyalty, of secrets, of themselves, all to secure a loaf of bread, a handful of grain, a promise of safety for their children. These bargains were not written in contracts, but carved into their souls, carried as scars that no one could see. I remember my grandmother once saying, "I gave away pieces of myself to keep others alive." She never explained. Her voice carried shame, but also strength. She had survived by sacrificing, by negotiating with enemies, by lowering her eyes when she wanted to scream. Her bargains had been silent, invisible, erased from history. But her scars lived in her silence. The truth they don't tell is that women bartered not only objects, but themselves. A shawl for a loaf, a wedding ring for flour, a body for protection, a secret for the life of a child. Each exchange was survival bought at a price too heavy to carry. Yet they carried it. They whispered bargains into the night, agreed with nods instead of words, walked away with food hidden under coats and scars hidden under silence. I once heard of a woman who gave away her last piece of jewelry, a gold locket containing a photograph of her parents, in exchange for medicine. Her daughter survived the fever, but the woman wept for years whenever she remembered the locket. "I saved her life," she said, "but I lost their faces." Her bargain had given life, but taken memory. Her scar was absence disguised as survival. Some bargains were darker. Women offered themselves to men with power, not out of desire, but out of desperation. They carried shame their entire lives, though the shame was never theirs. They endured whispers from neighbors, judgment from communities, silence within families. No one asked why they had done it, what they had gained, what lives had been saved. Their sacrifices were invisible, unacknowledged. Their scars were wounds hidden beneath moral judgments that never belonged to them. The truth they don't tell is that children were often the unknowing beneficiaries of these bargains. A loaf of bread appeared on the table, and they ate without asking where it came from. A warm blanket covered them, and they slept without knowing what was given in exchange. Mothers carried the silence of these bargains so their children would not carry the shame. Their scars were in the quiet smiles they forced as they served food earned through sacrifice. I remember my mother once holding me close and whispering, "Everything I did so you could live." I didn't understand then. Now I realize her words carried the weight of silent bargains I will never know. Her scar was not just in what she endured, but in what she hid from me. The silent bargains were not only with enemies. Women bargained with fate, with God, with themselves. They promised prayers in exchange for survival, swore oaths in the dark, gave away hope in small increments just to keep going one more day. They carried guilt for breaking those promises, for failing to deliver, for surviving when others didn't. Their scars were made not only by what they gave, but by what they believed they failed to keep. The truth they don't tell is that survival was never clean. It was not heroic in the ways history likes to remember. It was messy, painful, humiliating. Women bartered, begged, endured. They carried scars from choices they never wanted to make, but had to. Their survival was written not in triumph, but in bargains made silently, in sacrifices carried invisibly. I once read about a woman who was asked if she regretted what she had done to survive. She paused and answered, "I regret nothing, but I carry everything." Her words hold the truth of silent bargains. They are not mistakes, but weights. They are carried across years, across generations, never spoken, but always present. The silent bargains remind us that women's survival was not passive. It was active, costly, complex. They chose, they sacrificed, they endured. Their scars live not only in their bodies, but in their silences, in the words they never spoke, in the secrets they never revealed. And though the world may judge, though history may erase, their survival is proof that those bargains, however heavy, mattered. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that survival always has a price. Women paid it in silence. Their bargains may never be recorded, but their scars remain, invisible, eternal, reminders of courage measured in whispers and sacrifices too heavy to name. Lullabies made of dust. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that lullabies became more powerful than guns. When bombs shook the earth, when walls crumbled into dust, when hunger gnawed so deeply that children could not stop crying, women sang. Their voices were thin, their throats dry, their words fragile. Yet those lullabies, sung in cellars, in ruins, in refugee camps, became shields stronger than stone. They were made not of melody alone, but of dust, silence, and desperation. I remember my grandmother telling me how she sang to my mother during nights when the sky burned red. Her voice cracked, her breath shallow, but she hummed anyway. She said, if I stopped singing, she would know I was afraid. Her lullabies were not about sleep. They were about survival. They covered fear like a blanket, hid hunger inside rhythm, disguised despair with melody. Her scar was that she carried songs that tasted of ashes, lullabies made of dust. The truth they don't tell is that women's songs were never simply sweet. They were broken prayers, whispered confessions, lies dressed in tenderness. They sang of fields and rivers that no longer existed, of fathers who would never return, of tomorrows that might never come. Their children, too young to know, fell asleep in arms that trembled, soothed by voices that carried more grief than hope. The lullabies held them through nights that should have shattered them. I once heard of a woman who hummed the same tune every night in a cellar where dozens hid. At first it was for her baby, but soon every child in the shelter leaned into her voice, their cries softening. Parents wept silently, watching her voice carry what they could not. Years later, survivors said they still remembered that melody. They called it the song that kept us alive. Her scar was that she never sang it again after the war. It belonged to the dust, to the ruins, to the children who never woke. Lullabies became lies too. Women promised safety they could not guarantee, promised food that was not there, promised dawns that would not be kinder. They wrapped lies in melody because children needed hope more than truth. Their voices disguised fear, their songs carried dreams they no longer believed in themselves. Their scars lived in the dissonance between what they sang and what they knew. The truth they don't tell is that those songs scarred the mothers as much as they soothed the children. Every note reminded them of hunger, of absence, of the fragility of life. They sang to keep their children calm, but inside they broke, their voices carrying pain that never left. Many never sang again in peace. Music reminded them of bombs, of nights underground, of silence that followed songs when a child did not wake. I remember watching my mother hum to herself while washing dishes. The tune was soft, broken, almost inaudible. When I asked what it was, she said, "It's a lullaby I learned when I was little." Her eyes grew distant, her voice faded. I realize now she was remembering not comfort, but survival. Her scar was in the way melody had fused with fear, inseparable forever. Children inherited those lullabies like invisible scars. They grew up associating music with hunger, sleep with fear, tenderness with loss. Some avoided music altogether. Others clung to it, carrying songs as heirlooms of memory. They may not have understood the words, but they felt the weight in the melodies. Their scars were shaped in rhythm, passed silently from voice to ear, from generation to generation. The truth they don't tell is that lullabies were the only weapon women had. They could not stop bombs, they could not fill empty stomachs, they could not bring back the dead. But they could sing. They could wrap their children in sound, disguise despair as comfort, transform dust into melody. It was not victory, but it was survival. Their scars remind us that music is not always joy. Sometimes it is endurance. I once stood in a ruined house where mothers had once sung to their children. The walls were blackened, the ceiling gone. But in the silence, I thought I could almost hear it. Faint voices humming against fear, lullabies drifting through dust. I realized then that songs do not die. They live in memory, in ruins and scars. They remain as whispers of survival, reminders of what women carried. The lullabies made of dust remind us that history is not only written in battles and treaties, but in voices trembling in the dark. Women's songs were not recorded, but they saved lives. Their scars live in every melody carried through generations, in every silence where music once lived. They tell us that survival has a sound, fragile, quiet, broken, but eternal. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that their voices were the softest, yet most powerful weapons. They sang when silence would have killed, whispered when fear was too heavy, turned dust into comfort. And though the world may forget, their lullabies remain, fragile songs that carried survival through the ruins. The walls that hid their names. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that names were more dangerous than bullets. A name spoken at the wrong time could mean betrayal, arrest, execution. A name whispered in the wrong place could vanish a person forever. And so, women learned to hide names, not in papers, not in voices, but in walls, ruins, cracks of stone that carried secrets longer than any human breath. I remember hearing about a woman who carved the names of her children into the wooden beams of a collapsed house. She knew they might not survive the winter, but she wanted proof they had lived. "If no one remembers us, the walls will," she said. Those beams carried her love and her defiance. Her scars were not only in her body, but in the wood that kept her children's existence alive. The truth they don't tell is that women wrote names in places no one looked. They scratched them beneath tables, stitched them into hems of clothing, pressed them into the dirt of cellars. Sometimes they wrote in code, initials, symbols, secret marks, so enemies could not understand, but family would. Their survival depended not only on keeping bodies alive, but on keeping names alive. I once read about a refugee camp where mothers whispered their children's names into walls before fleeing. They believed the walls would remember when they could not. Years later, when the ruins were discovered, faint scratches remained, letters half faded, but enough to testify that they had been there. Their scars became memory carved into stone. The walls that hid names also carried silence. Women refused to say aloud who had been taken, who had been killed, who had vanished. Instead, they left traces only the ruins could hold. Names were whispered to bricks, to ashes, to rubble. The act itself was an act of resistance, refusing to let names disappear entirely. I remember my mother tracing her finger along the cracks of a wall one evening, whispering softly. When I asked what she was doing, she said, "I'm reminding the walls who we are." I didn't understand then. Now I know she was leaving memory in stone, trusting it to hold what silence could not. The truth they don't tell is that women's identities often disappeared officially, erased from records, lost in migrations, burned in fires. But unofficially, secretly, women kept those names alive in hidden inscriptions. History forgot them, but the walls did not. Scars were carved into brick and wood, lasting longer than memory itself. Children grew up not knowing that their names had been hidden. They carried them proudly, unaware that those same names had once been whispered in fear, carved in secret. Their mothers never told them, but the scars remained in the walls of ruined houses, in the fragments of furniture, in the stones of abandoned streets. The cruelty was that some names were never found. They remained trapped in ruins, carved into walls that no one read, buried in rubble that no one uncovered. Those scars are still there, invisible to eyes but alive in silence. If we could peel back the layers of stone, we would find women's handwriting in every ruin, proof of life against the erasure of war. I once walked through a destroyed church, its walls crumbling, its windows gone. On a column, faint letters were etched, initials almost erased by time. No one knew who had carved them, but I stood there knowing they belonged to someone who had lived, someone a woman had refused to let vanish. That was her scar, a name hidden in stone, waiting for someone to remember. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that their voices may have been silenced, but their hands spoke. They carved names into walls so the world could not erase them. They trusted ruins more than people, shadows more than records. Their scars remain in stone and wood, silent witnesses to lives the world forgot. The walls that hid their names remind us that survival is not only about bodies. It is about memory, identity, existence. Women refused to let names die, even if they could not protect the people who bore them. They turned ruins into archives, walls into tombstones, silence into testimony. Their scars live in every hidden inscription, every forgotten initial, every name etched into stone by trembling hands. And if you lean close enough to the ruins, you might still hear them. Names whispered into cracks, secrets hidden in walls, the echoes of women who refused to let memory die. The wells where secrets were buried. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that water became more than survival. Wells, rivers, cisterns, and streams were not only places to drink or wash. They became vaults of memory, hiding places for secrets, graves for what could not be carried. Women dropped into the depths not only buckets of water but also letters, jewelry, photographs, even voices they could not bear to speak aloud. Wells became silent archives, swallowing what the world was not ready to hold. I remember my grandmother pointing to an old well behind her childhood home. She said softly, "That well knows more secrets than any priest." At the time, I thought she meant gossip. Later, I understood. That well had received whispers, tears, and objects too dangerous to keep. It had been a sanctuary where silence met water, where memory was both hidden and preserved. The truth they don't tell is that women trusted water more than people. When soldiers searched homes, when neighbors betrayed each other, when words could mean death, the well became a confidant. A whispered prayer dropped into its darkness was safer than a confession to another soul. Some women said names into wells, just to hear them echo back, proof that memory had not been erased. Their scars were bound to that echo, fragile, hollow, but real. I once heard of a woman who threw her wedding ring into a well. She said it was the only way to protect her family. If soldiers found it, it would mark her as someone to be exploited. She wept as the ring vanished into the dark water, carrying both her love and her safety. Her scar was the emptiness of her hand, a reminder of a sacrifice no one else saw. Wells became hiding places for documents too. Women slipped letters into, Jars sealed them with wax and lowered them beneath the water, trusting that one day, when the war ended, someone might recover them. Some were found decades later, fragments of words blurred but still alive. Others remain at the bottom of forgotten wells, their secrets preserved in silence. The scars of those women lived not only in their memories, but in the knowledge that pieces of their lives remained trapped in darkness. The truth they don't tell is that wells also became graves. When there was no earth to bury loved ones, when soldiers forbade mourning, when silence was safer than ritual, women dropped small tokens, a lock of hair, a child's toy, a photograph, into the water. They transformed wells into invisible cemeteries, places where grief sank quietly beneath the surface. Their scars lived in the way they avoided those wells afterward, unable to drink from waters that carried their sorrow. I remember a story of a mother who whispered her son's name into a well every night after he disappeared. She said the echo was her only proof that he had existed, that someone still remembered. She told her granddaughter later, the well kept him when no one else did. Her scar was the hollow sound of his name, carried back to her by water that could not answer. Children learned these rituals too. They threw pebbles into wells with wishes, not knowing those wishes were often confessions. They watched their mothers lean over stone rims, lips moving silently, eyes closed. They inherited the habit of trusting water with secrets too heavy for words. Their scars became the silence around wells, the respect for places that carried more than water. The truth they don't tell is that women turned water into a witness. They believed wells could hold memory, rivers could carry grief away, streams could wash pain into places unseen. They transformed the natural world into confidants, weaving survival into rituals no one documented. Their scars lived not only in their bodies, but in landscapes altered by whispered secrets. I once stood beside a ruined well in a village long abandoned. The stones were cracked, the rope frayed, the bucket gone. Yet I felt an almost unbearable weight in the air, as if the well still carried whispers, as if the water beneath still held secrets never retrieved. I realized then that wells are not empty. They are full of everything poured into them: water, memory, silence, scars. The wells where secrets were buried remind us that women survived not only by enduring, but by transforming the world around them into allies. They made water into archives, echoes into witnesses, silence into testimony. Their scars remain in every ruined well, every dry cistern, every echo still carrying names too dangerous to speak aloud. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that survival required hiding more than bodies. It required hiding memories, hiding grief, hiding truth itself. Women buried secrets in wells not because they wanted to forget, but because they wanted them to survive. And even now, those waters still hold what history has ignored: the threads that held them together. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that survival was often stitched by hand, not only in the mending of clothes torn by rubble, but in the weaving of community, in the quiet act of threading pieces of life back together when everything had been torn apart. Needles and threads became weapons against despair. Every stitch was defiance, every patchwork a declaration that they would not allow the world to unravel them completely. I remember my grandmother's basket of threads, scraps of color saved from old garments, bits of cloth too small to cover anything but too precious to throw away. She said, "You never know when a thread will save you." I thought she meant clothing. Later, I realized she meant more. Threads saved dignity, warmth, memory, survival. Her scars were not only on her skin, but also in the calluses of her fingers, in the way her hands shook after years of sewing in the dark. The truth they don't tell is that women stitched silence as much as fabric. They repaired uniforms without asking who they belonged to. They sewed blankets from scraps, turning rags into warmth. They patched holes in children's clothes again and again, making garments last beyond their years. Their sewing carried whispers of love, of loss, of endurance. Needles moved when words could not. I once heard of women in a camp who gathered at night to sew. They patched each other's clothes, but also stitched small symbols into hidden seams: initials, flowers, stars. These were not decorations. They were secret acts of memory, ways of saying, "You are still here. You are still you." Their scars lived in the quiet nights bent over needles, holding community together with fragile threads. Threads held not only fabric, but families. Women sewed together blankets large enough to cover groups of children in cellars, hiding them from cold and fear. They patched tents that housed dozens, stitched sacks to carry whatever little food was left. Their hands never rested. The sound of a needle through cloth became a lullaby of its own, a rhythm that promised survival. The truth they don't tell is that women also used threads to record history. Some stitched entire stories into quilts. Battles survived, homes destroyed, families lost. They wove memory into patterns, symbols into fabric. These textiles became testimonies no book contained, fragile archives of survival carried in cloth. Their scars lived in these secret tapestries where silence was turned into design. I remember once unfolding an old quilt my grandmother had kept hidden for years. At first, it looked like scraps of fabric sewn together. But as I studied it, I saw patterns. A square of black for the night her village burned, a strip of red for blood, a patch of blue for the river she crossed in exile. Each piece was a scar disguised as fabric. The quilt was not only warmth, it was memory stitched by trembling hands. Children learned these lessons too. They watched their mothers sew and understood that every stitch meant survival. They grew up valuing fabric not as luxury but as lifeline. Their scars were the memories of patched clothes, of blankets smelling of smoke, of garments stitched with more love than material. The truth they don't tell is that threads were also used to resist. Women stitched hidden pockets into clothes to smuggle food, letters, even medicine. They used embroidery to pass codes, designs that carried messages only allies understood. Their needles became tools of rebellion, their threads lifelines hidden in plain sight. Survival was sewn into the seams of their garments. I once read of a woman who stitched seeds into the hems of her dress, carrying them across borders. Years later, she planted them in a new land, growing food for her children. Her scars were not only hunger endured, but also the thread that carried life through exile. The threads that held them together remind us that survival was not only in great acts of defiance, but in small stitches repeated endlessly. Women kept families clothed, communities warm, memories alive. Their scars live in fabric worn thin, in quilts preserved, in hands calloused from years of silent stitching. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that they were seamstresses of survival. They sewed not only garments, but dignity, hope, and community. And though history rarely records their stitches, the fabric of memory still carries their threads. Every patch is a scar. Every seam is a secret. Every quilt is testimony. The gardens grown in ashes. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that life was planted in ashes. When bombs reduced houses to rubble, when entire villages turned into fields of gray dust, when famine threatened to erase every trace of hope, women still placed seeds into soil, even if that soil was mixed with ashes, blood, and broken glass. Gardens became their rebellion. To grow something green where death reigned was to whisper to the ruins, "You will not win." I remember my grandmother pointing to the small patch of earth behind her home, long after the war had ended. Flowers bloomed there, stubborn and bright. She said softly, "These are not flowers. They are proof." At the time, I didn't understand. Later, I realized they were proof of defiance, proof that she had once planted life where there was none, proof that even the ashes of war could be forced to hold beauty. Her scars were hidden in those petals, fragile but unyielding. The truth they don't tell is that women often planted with hands that trembled, not because they believed the seeds would grow, but because they needed to believe it was possible. They buried beans, potatoes, herbs in corners of ruins, in cracks of streets, in abandoned courtyards. Sometimes nothing sprouted. Sometimes weeds consumed everything. But sometimes, impossibly, green pushed through gray. And when it did, it became more than food. It became survival woven with hope. I once heard of women in a destroyed village who gathered every morning to clear rubble from a courtyard. With broken spoons and bent nails, they scraped away debris, then pressed seeds into the soil. Neighbors called them foolish. Soldiers mocked them. But months later, green leaves sprouted where walls had collapsed. The women wept, not for food, though they ate it gratefully, but for the miracle of life insisting on existing. Their scars turned into roots, their grief into blossoms. Gardens and ashes were not only physical. Women planted memory too. They pressed photographs into soil, whispered names as they buried seeds, prayed that each sprout would carry a life remembered. Some called the plants by the names of those they lost, tending them as if they were children returned in fragile form. Their scars lived in those gardens, where grief and hope grew side by side. The truth they don't tell is that sometimes women risked their lives for seeds. Soldiers burned fields, forbade planting, controlled harvests. Women smuggled seeds in hems, hid them in braids, carried them in pockets. Seeds became contraband, more valuable than gold. Every sprout was a victory, every harvest a rebellion. Their survival was rooted in defiance, disguised as gardening. I remember a woman who told me she once carried sunflower seeds sewn into her coat lining. She said, "I wanted to know that when I died, something would still grow." Her sunflowers later bloomed beside a ruined church, towering over rubble like golden flames. People said they were the most beautiful flowers they had ever seen. Her scars were in those seeds, planted in fear but blooming in defiance. Children grew up in these gardens of ashes, learning to see life in fragile sprouts. They pulled weeds with tiny hands, watered plants with tin cups, sang to leaves that trembled in the wind. Their scars were the memory of hunger, but also the memory of green, proof that even in destruction, life insisted on itself. Those gardens shaped their souls, teaching them that survival was not only endurance, but creation. The truth they don't tell is that gardens were also symbols of silence. Women did not speak openly of their losses, their pain, their despair. Instead, they planted. Each row of potatoes was a line of grief unspoken. Each flower bed was a chapter of memory left untold. Their gardens became unrecorded histories, testaments written not in words but in roots and leaves. I once stood in the ruins of a house where wildflowers grew through cracks in the floor. No one had planted them, or perhaps someone had long ago, but they felt like memory made visible, scars turned into blossoms. I realized then that ruins are never empty. They are full of what women forced to grow in silence. The gardens grown in ashes remind us that survival is not only about endurance, but about insisting on beauty in places where beauty has no right to exist. Women planted not because they believed in certainty, but because they refused to surrender. Their scars bloom still, in flowers growing in ruins, in seeds passed down through generations, in fields that once were battlefields but now are alive. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that they were gardeners of survival. They turned ashes into soil, ruins into fields, silence into blossoms. And though history may forget their hands, the earth remembers. Every flower in a ruined street, every tree in a once bombed village, every green sprout where only gray remained is their testimony. The songs they were forbidden to sing. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that silence was often enforced, even on melodies. Songs that once carried weddings, births, harvests, and laughter were declared dangerous. To sing was to resist, to remember, to connect with a past the war wanted erased. And so, women were forbidden to sing. But in their silence, music did not die. It transformed. It hid in whispers, in hums, in lullabies that trembled like secret prayers. I remember my grandmother's voice when she spoke of the old songs of her village. She never sang them in full. She hummed fragments, low and trembling, always stopping before the melody could bloom. When I asked why, she said, "Because they took those songs from us." Yet I knew the song still lived inside her, pressed deep like seeds waiting for spring. Her scar was not in silence alone, but in the memory of music forbidden. The truth they don't tell is that women carried songs in their bodies even when they could not carry them in air. They tapped rhythms softly against their legs while working, whispered verses into the ears of infants too young to repeat them, hummed melodies so quietly that only their own hearts could hear. Their silence was filled with music. Their survival was measured not only in endurance, but in the fragments of songs they refused to forget. I once heard of a group of women who gathered to wash clothes by a river. Soldiers forbade singing, yet as they beat garments against stones, they created rhythm together. One began to hum softly. Another joined. Soon, their labor became music disguised as work. Anyone listening might have thought it was only noise. But the women knew. Their scars were the rhythms they carried silently, coded rebellions disguised as daily chores. The forbidden songs were not only cultural, they were personal. Women avoided singing lullabies that reminded them of children lost, hymns that recalled weddings now erased, melodies that carried voices of fathers, brothers, husbands who never returned. Their throats carried silence heavier than any scream. To sing was to break open wounds that could never heal. Their scars were measured in the notes they swallowed. The truth they don't tell is that silence became music of its own. Women's quiet movements, the scrape of a spoon against a pot, the rhythm of sewing needles, the whisper of hands washing clothes in rivers, these became the songs of survival. They carried music without melody, harmony without sound. And though no one would write them down, those rhythms lived in memory like secret hymns. I remember my mother's silence whenever a song from the radio carried echoes of the past. She would stop, freeze, her eyes distant. Then she would turn it off. She said she didn't like the music. But I knew her scar was not dislike. It was memory. The song carried her back to nights of fear, to whispers in ruins, to silences filled with forbidden melodies. Children grew up not knowing the songs their mothers once sang. Some never heard them at all. Others received fragments, half verses, incomplete choruses, melodies broken by pauses. They inherited silence as much as music. Their scars were not knowing what had been lost, feeling the weight of songs never sung. The truth they don't tell is that when the war ended, many women still could not sing. Their voices remained trapped, their throats carrying silence like chains. Music reminded them too much of what had been forbidden, too much of what had been lost. Even in peace, they hummed only fragments, sang only for themselves. Their scars were the absence of melody, the emptiness of silence where songs once lived. And yet some women began to sing again, slowly, quietly, trembling. They revived melodies that had been buried in silence, offering them like fragile gifts to new generations. Their voices cracked, but they sang anyway. Every note was a scar, a reminder of music stolen and reclaimed. Their songs became testimonies, fragile and trembling, but alive. I once attended a gathering where an old woman sang a song that had been forbidden for decades. Her voice was shaky, the melody simple, but everyone listening wept. They said it was as if the walls themselves remembered, as if the ruins leaned closer to hear. Her scar was still there, but her voice rose through it, transforming silence into survival. The songs they were forbidden to sing remind us that survival is not only about bodies and bread, but about memory and melody. Women carried music even when silenced, preserved culture and whispers, turned silence into rhythm. Their scars live in every fragment hummed, in every song cut short, in every silence too heavy to break. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that silence was not emptiness. It was music forced underground, surviving in whispers, waiting for voices brave enough to rise again. And though the world may forget, the melodies remain, hidden beneath scars, carried forward by women who refused to let silence erase them. The keys they carried. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that many of them carried keys long after the doors had been destroyed. Keys to homes that no longer stood, keys to trunks burned to ashes, keys to gates rusted shut by silence. Women clutched them like relics, hung them on strings around their necks, hid them in pockets, buried them in bundles of clothing. The keys were not metal alone. They were memory, hope, testimony. They said, "I once belonged somewhere. I once had a door to open." I remember my grandmother's drawer where, hidden beneath folded scarves, lay a heavy iron key. She never told me what door it opened. When I asked, she said softly, "It doesn't open anything now, but it reminds me there was once a door." Her scar was not only the home she lost, but the weight of carrying a key to emptiness. The truth they don't tell is that women carried these keys across borders, through camps, into exile. They rattled in pockets as women waited in bread lines, pressed cold against skin as they crossed rivers, rested heavy in hands trembling with fatigue. Each key was both burden and anchor. To drop it would mean surrendering the memory of home. To carry it was to insist that ruins did not erase belonging. I once read of a woman who carried 3 keys on a chain around her neck, one to her house, one to her parents' home, one to her sister's bakery. None of those buildings survived. Yet she wore the keys every day until her death. Her children asked why, and she answered, "Because they remind me that once we opened doors instead of graves." Her scars clinked together softly, metal reminders of a life reduced to silence. Keys became symbols of identity. Women showed them to children like sacred relics. This was our door. This was our house. This is who we were. The children grew up holding keys that fit no locks, inheriting the weight of belonging to places that no longer existed. Their scars were the metallic taste of memory, the feel of keys cold in their palms, doors forever closed. The truth they don't tell is that keys also became prayers. Women whispered promises while holding them. We will return. This lock will open again. Even when they knew the houses were gone, they carried the hope that keys could still unlock something. If not walls, then memory. If not doors, then dignity. Their survival was tied to metal that held more faith than function. I remember an old woman in a camp who carried a tiny brass key on a string. She said it was to a jewelry box her husband had given her before the war. The box was gone, stolen, burned. She didn't know. But she kept the key. It still opens something, she said. It opens me. Her scar was not only loss, but the stubborn refusal to let loss have the final word. The keys they carried also marked grief. Some women buried keys with loved ones when there was no coffin, no grave, no marker. A key in a pocket of a dead child, a key tied around a husband's neck. These were last rites, silent funerals. The key became both closure and release, a way of saying you belonged. You had a home. Their scars lived in the emptiness left behind when no locks remained to match the keys. Children sometimes played with these keys, unaware of their weight. They rattled them like toys, pressed them into dirt, traced their shapes. Only later did they realize the keys were not toys, but testimonies. They were holding pieces of memory heavier than iron. Their scars were formed long before they understood what those objects meant. The truth they don't tell is that many of those keys still exist. They lie in drawers, hang from chains, rest in boxes of heirlooms. They are artifacts of exile, metal relics of homes erased. Museums sometimes display them, but for women, they were never artifacts. They were lifelines, proof, survival disguised as cold, heavy shapes. I once stood in a memorial where hundreds of keys hung from wires, suspended in air. Each one had belonged to someone who had lost their home, their village, their family. They clinked softly when the wind moved, like whispers of memory. I thought then of all the women who had carried them, the scars hidden in their pockets, the hopes bound in iron. The keys they carried remind us that survival is not only about breath and bread. It is about belonging. Women refused to let war erase the fact that they once had homes, once had doors, once had places where they were safe. Their scars live in every key carried across ruins, across borders, across time. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that they carried not just children, not just hunger, not just silence, but keys. Heavy, useless, sacred keys. And though the locks are gone, the memory they hold remains, unbroken, eternal. The letters that were never sent. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that survival was also written on paper that never reached another soul. Letters became confessions, prayers, screams disguised as words. Women wrote to husbands who would never return, to children already buried, to families scattered across borders. They poured their lives into ink, then folded those letters and hid them in walls, in pockets, in books, in ruins. They never mailed them, but they needed to write them. Their survival was stitched into words no one would ever read. I remember opening a chest in my grandmother's house after she passed. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were letters written in her handwriting, yellowed by time. None were addressed, none were sent. They were fragments of her silence, written in nights when she could not speak aloud. In them, she confessed fears, begged for forgiveness, whispered love. Her scars were carried not only in her body, but in those folded papers, trembling testimonies she never meant to share. The truth they don't tell is that letters were safer than voices. Words spoken aloud could betray. A whisper overheard could cost lives. But paper listened without judgment, without risk. Ink carried truths women could not entrust to people. Their pens became their only confidants, their writing the only place where grief could live freely. Their scars were ink stains on fingers, smudges on pages, words crossed out in despair. I once heard of a woman who wrote to her son every day after he was taken away, though she never knew where he had gone. She hid the letters in a box under her bed. When she died, her daughter found them, hundreds of pages filled with love, memory, advice, and longing. I don't know if you are alive, one letter read, but I write so you will not be forgotten. Her scar was the silence of never receiving an answer. the one-sided conversation that lasted until her death. Some letters were confessions of guilt. Women wrote apologies to children they could not save, to neighbors they could not help, to lives they could not protect. They wrote words they could never say aloud, words that would have broken them if spoken. Their scars lived in those pages, folded again and again, hidden deep in places no one would look. The truth they don't tell is that some women burned their letters after writing them. They let flames consume their words because keeping them was too dangerous, because discovery meant death. Yet even in burning, those letters served their purpose. The act of writing had freed the weight. Their scars rose as smoke, unseen but eternal. I remember my mother once telling me, "Sometimes we write not to send, but to survive." She kept a notebook filled with entries that read like letters, though they bore no names. She said writing gave her breath when silence suffocated her. Her scars were the pages she tore out, the words she never let anyone else read. Children inherited fragments of these unsent letters. Some found them after mothers passed, others only heard about them in whispers. They read confessions not meant for their eyes, learned truths too heavy for their hearts. Their scars were shaped by words written in desperation, words that both preserved and wounded. The truth they don't tell is that letters became graves too. Women wrote names of the dead, stories of their lives, then folded the paper as if burying them. They left these letters in ruins, slipped them under stones, pressed them into walls. They believed that if no tombstones could be raised, words would serve as markers. Their scars lived in the letters hidden in silence, testimonies buried in ink. I once stood in a museum where a glass case displayed unsent letters from women during war. The ink was faded, the handwriting shaky. Some were torn, others stained by tears. Reading them felt like listening to whispers from the past, voices that had been silenced yet still spoke through paper. I realized then that unsent letters are not failures. They are survival in written form. The letters that were never sent remind us that survival is not only about what is said, but about what is written in silence. Women poured their souls into pages they knew would never reach anyone, because the act of writing was itself resistance. Their scars live in folded papers, in hidden chests, in burned ashes. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that even when their voices were stolen, their hands found ways to speak. And though those letters never traveled, they remain, fragments of survival, whispers beneath the ruins, testimonies etched in ink and silence. When silence became their last language. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that silence was their final language. After the bombs stopped, after the rubble was cleared, after the treaties were signed and the soldiers went home, silence remained. It was the only language that did not betray them, the only one that could carry the weight of memory without breaking. Women spoke less, but their eyes carried whole books. They laughed softly, but their scars screamed louder than any voice. I remember sitting with my grandmother on a quiet evening. She watched the horizon as if searching for something only she could see. I asked her about the war. She shook her head, placed her hand on mine, and whispered, "Some things live better in silence." Her silence was not emptiness. It was testimony. It was memory she refused to hand to words because words would break it, diminish it, betray it. Her scar was silence itself, her last language. The truth they don't tell is that women built entire lives around silence. They cooked, cleaned, worked, raised children without speaking of what they had endured. Their children grew up in households where shadows lingered in corners, where lullabies stopped before the last verse, where photographs were missing from walls. Silence became inheritance. It shaped generations as much as war itself. I once heard of a woman who never spoke her husband's name after he disappeared. Not once. She erased it from her tongue, but not from her heart. When asked why, she said, "Speaking it would remind me he is gone. Keeping silent lets me pretend he is still here." Her silence was her scar, her shield, her survival. Silence was not always chosen. Sometimes it was forced. Women knew that speaking of what had been done to them would bring judgment, shame, rejection. So they swallowed their stories, locking them in their bodies. Their silence was both protection and prison. Their scars lived in throats that never opened, in words that dissolved before reaching air. The truth they don't tell is that silence bound women together. They recognized each other's unspoken grief in glances, in gestures, in pauses. They did not need to speak to understand. Their silence was a collective language, spoken across kitchens, in fields, at market stalls. It was a chorus of absence, a symphony of unuttered truths. I remember watching my mother and her sister sit together in silence for hours. No words passed between them, yet when they parted, they embraced with tears. I asked what they had talked about. My mother said, everything. Their silence carried more meaning than speech ever could. Their scars had found a way to speak without words. Children inherited silence too. They grew up sensing truths never told, piecing together histories from fragments, feeling the weight of things left unsaid. Their own language carried pauses, hesitations, gaps. They learned to respect silence, to live inside it, to see it not as absence but as presence. Their scars were shaped by stories never spoken, by mysteries carried across generations. The truth they don't tell is that silence was also resistance. By refusing to tell everything, women kept parts of themselves untouched by war. Silence became ownership of their own pain, a way of saying, "You cannot have all of me." Their scars were not just wounds, but boundaries drawn with absence. And yet silence also longed for voice. In secret notebooks, in hidden songs, in whispered prayers, women let pieces of their silence out. They balanced between speech and silence, memory and forgetting, grief and survival. Their last language was not silence alone, but silence woven with fragments of expression. I once stood in a ruined village where no one lived anymore. The wind moved through broken houses, carrying no voices. And yet I felt silence speaking. Heavy, alive, filled with everything that had once happened there. I realized then that silence is never empty. It is full of memory, of scars, of whispers too heavy for words. The silence that became their last language reminds us that survival is not always loud, not always visible. Sometimes it is the absence of sound, the refusal to explain, the choice to carry memory quietly. Women endured not only through what they said, but through what they kept. Their scars speak still, even in silence. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that their survival is written in whispers. In scars, in songs unsung, in gardens grown in ashes, in keys carried to doors that no longer exist, in letters never sent. And when words are gone, silence remains, eternal, unbroken, heavy with memory. Silence became their last language, and in it, their survival still speaks.